when I felt my husband's hands push me backward toward the rocky ledge. The last thing I saw was his face twisted with a hatred I had never witnessed in our 32 years of marriage. The last words I heard before my body tumbled down that steep hillside were the cruelest he had ever spoken to me. "Go die, you useless old woman." Those 7 words echoed in my ears as I fell, bouncing off rocks and scraping against thorny bushes, my 68-year-old body unable to stop the violent descent. In that moment, plummeting toward what seemed like certain death, I thought about how foolish I had been to trust the man who had shared my bed for over 3 decades. I thought about how blind I had been to the signs that had been staring me in the face for months. My name is Dorothy, and what I'm about to tell you is the story of how my own husband tried to murder me for money and love, and how I survived to make sure justice was served. This isn't just a story about betrayal or attempted murder. This is a story about how sometimes the people we trust most are capable of the most unthinkable acts, and how the universe has a way of ensuring that evil doesn't go unpunished. Let me take you back to the beginning, because the events that led to that terrible day didn't happen overnight. They had been building for months, maybe even years, right under my nose. I had been married to Robert for 32 years. We met when I was 36 and he was 38, both of us starting what we thought would be our second chance at love after failed first marriages. Robert was charming, attentive, and seemed genuinely interested in building a life together. We had weathered financial struggles, family losses, and all the ups and downs that come with a long marriage. For most of our marriage, I had been the primary breadwinner. I worked as a nurse at the county hospital for over 40 years, pulling double shifts and working weekends to make sure our family was financially stable. Robert had various jobs over the years, but nothing that ever paid particularly well or lasted very long. He was always between opportunities, always had some new business idea that required just a little more investment, always needed just a little more time to get on his feet. I didn't mind. I loved him, and I believed in the partnership we had built together. 3 years ago, when I turned 65, I finally retired from the hospital. After 4 decades of caring for others, I was looking forward to spending time with my husband, maybe traveling a little, enjoying the golden years we had worked so hard to reach. I had saved diligently throughout my career, contributed to my pension fund religiously, and we owned our home outright. Between my retirement savings, my pension, and the equity in our house, we were comfortable. Not wealthy, but comfortable enough to live without financial stress for the rest of our lives. That's when things started to change. That's when Robert started to change. At first, the changes were subtle. He became more interested in our finances than he had ever been during our marriage. Suddenly, he wanted to know exact amounts in our accounts, wanted to understand the details of my pension payments, asked questions about my life insurance policy. He said he was just trying to be more responsible, more involved in our financial planning, now that we were both older. It seemed reasonable at the time. I had always handled the money because I was better with numbers and more disciplined about saving. I thought his newfound interest was actually a positive development. Then he started suggesting that we consolidate our accounts, put everything in both our names for easier management. He talked about how it would be simpler if something happened to one of us, how the surviving spouse wouldn't have to deal with complicated legal processes. Again, it seemed to make sense. We had been married for 3 decades. We were partners. Why wouldn't we share everything completely? So I did it. I added his name to my retirement accounts, to my savings, to everything. I trusted him completely because he was my husband, and after 32 years together, I never imagined he could be planning anything other than our mutual benefit. The next change I noticed was his appearance. Robert had never been particularly concerned with how he looked, but suddenly he was buying new clothes, working out at a gym he had never mentioned joining, dyeing his hair to cover the gray that had been there for years. When I asked him about it, he said he was just trying to take better care of himself, that he wanted to be healthy and look good for me in our retirement years. I was happy that he was taking an interest in his health and appearance. I thought it was wonderful that my husband wanted to look and feel his best. Then came the phone calls, late-night conversations that he would take in the garage or out on the back porch. When I asked who he was talking to, he would say it was his brother or an old friend from work, just catching up on things. But the calls became more frequent, and his explanations became more vague. Sometimes I would catch him texting, and he would quickly put his phone away when I entered the room. When I asked about it, he would get defensive, saying I was being paranoid and that he deserved some privacy, even in marriage. I started to feel like I was living with a stranger. The man who had shared my life for over 30 years was becoming secretive, distant, almost like he was living a double life. But I pushed those thoughts away because I loved him, and because after 3 decades together, I couldn't imagine that Robert could be capable of deceiving me in any significant way. The final piece of the puzzle came into focus about 6 months before that terrible day on the hillside. I was doing laundry and found a receipt in Robert's pants pocket for a restaurant I had never heard of. It was for dinner for 2, and it was expensive, much more than we would normally spend on a meal. When I asked him about it, he said he had taken a potential business partner out to discuss an investment opportunity, but something about his explanation didn't sit right with me. That night, I did something I had never done in our entire marriage. I looked through his phone while he was sleeping. What I found broke my heart into 1,000 pieces. Text messages to someone named Cheryl. Messages that were intimate, loving, sexual. Messages that talked about their future together, about how much they missed each other when they couldn't be together. Messages that made it clear this wasn't just a casual affair, but a full-blown relationship with someone who believed she was going to be his wife. I confronted him the next morning. I showed him the messages. I demanded an explanation. And for the first time in our marriage, Robert didn't even try to deny what he had done. Instead, he became angry. He told me I had no right to go through his private communications. He told me that what he did with his personal relationships was none of my business. He acted as if I was the one who had done something wrong by discovering his betrayal. That's when he told me he wanted a divorce. Not in a sad, regretful way that acknowledged the pain he had caused, but in a cold, matter-of-fact way that made it clear he had been planning this conversation for a long time. He said he had fallen in love with someone else, someone who made him feel alive again, someone who appreciated him in ways I never had. He said he deserved to be happy in whatever years he had left, and that meant being with Cheryl instead of me. The divorce proceedings began immediately. Robert hired an expensive lawyer, one whose fees I knew he couldn't afford on his own. I later discovered that Cheryl was funding his legal representation. She was a woman in her early 50s who had recently inherited a substantial sum from her deceased husband. She was wealthy, lonely, and had fallen completely for Robert's charm and lies about his unhappy marriage to an unappreciative wife. During the divorce negotiations, Robert fought for everything: half of my retirement savings, half of my pension, half the value of our house, even though I had paid for virtually everything throughout our marriage. His lawyer argued that as my spouse of over 30 years, Robert was entitled to 50% of all marital assets, regardless of who had actually earned the money. My lawyer told me that unfortunately, the law was on his side, even though I had been the primary breadwinner, even though I had saved every penny while he spent frivolously, even though he was leaving me for another woman. He was still legally entitled to half of everything we had accumulated during our marriage. The financial calculations were devastating. After 32 years of marriage, after 40 years of hard work and careful saving, I was going to lose hundreds of thousands of dollars to a man who had betrayed me in the cruelest possible way. My comfortable retirement was going to become a struggle to make ends meet on half the money I had planned to live on. Meanwhile, Robert would take his half of my life savings and start a new life with his wealthy girlfriend, living better than he ever had during our marriage. But even that wasn't enough for him. Even taking half of everything I had worked for wasn't enough to satisfy Robert's greed and his desire to completely erase me from his life. He wanted it all, and he had come up with a plan to get it. The divorce was scheduled to be finalized in just 2 weeks. All the paperwork was completed, the asset division was agreed upon, and soon Robert would walk away with hundreds of thousands of dollars that I had earned and saved. But apparently, half of everything wasn't enough. Apparently, Robert had decided that he deserved 100% of my life's work, and he was willing to kill me to get it. That's what led to that terrible day 3 weeks ago, when my husband of 32 years tried to murder me on a hiking trail we had walked together dozens of times during happier years. That's what led to the moment when the man I had loved and trusted completely showed me just how little my life meant to him compared to the money he would inherit if I died before our divorce was finalized. But Robert made one critical mistake in his plan to kill me and steal everything I had worked for. He underestimated just how strong and determined a 68-year-old woman can be when she's fighting for her life and her dignity. When I regained consciousness, I was lying at the bottom of that steep hillside, my body broken and bleeding, but somehow still breathing. The pain was excruciating. My left arm was twisted at an unnatural angle, clearly broken. My ribs felt like they were on fire with every breath I took. Blood was trickling down my face from a gash on my forehead, and my entire body felt like it had been put through a meat grinder. But I was alive. Against all odds, despite Robert's vicious attempt to end my life, I was still breathing. I lay there for what felt like hours, drifting in and out of consciousness, trying to process what had just happened. The man I had loved for over 3 decades had just tried to murder me. He had looked me in the eyes and pushed me off that cliff with the intention of killing me so he could inherit everything I had worked for my entire life. The physical pain was nothing compared to the emotional devastation of that realization. This wasn't just about the affair or the divorce anymore. This was about a man who was willing to commit murder to avoid giving me even the half of my own money that the law required him to share. As I lay there broken at the bottom of that ravine, something inside me changed forever. The trusting, forgiving woman who had spent 32 years making excuses for Robert's failures and shortcomings died on those rocks along with my old life. What crawled out of that ravine hours later was someone completely different, someone who understood that sometimes the people closest to you are capable of evil beyond your imagination. I managed to drag myself to my cell phone, which had somehow survived the fall. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely dial, but I called 911 and told them I had fallen while hiking alone. I didn't mention Robert. I didn't tell them about the push or the attempt on my life. Something told me to keep that information to myself until I could figure out exactly what I was going to do about it. The paramedics found me 3 hours later. They were amazed I had survived such a serious fall. The emergency room doctors said it was a miracle I hadn't died from internal bleeding or a head injury. I had a broken arm, 3 cracked ribs, a concussion, and more cuts and bruises than they could count, but somehow no life-threatening injuries. Robert showed up at the hospital exactly 4 hours after I was admitted. He played the part of the concerned husband perfectly, crying crocodile tears and telling everyone how worried he had been when I didn't come home from my hike. He held my unbroken hand and whispered how sorry he was that this had happened, how grateful he was that I was alive. The nurses and doctors all commented on what a devoted husband he was, staying by my bedside and refusing to leave even to get something to eat. If I hadn't known the truth, if I hadn't felt his hands pushing me toward that cliff, I might have been fooled by his performance myself. He was that convincing in his role as the loving, worried spouse. But I knew better. I could see right through his act. Every tear he shed was fake. Every word of concern was a lie. He wasn't there because he was worried about me. He was there to make sure I died from my injuries. And when that didn't happen, he was there to maintain his cover story. During the 2 days I spent in the hospital, I had plenty of time to think. I had plenty of time to plan. And I came to several important conclusions about my situation and what I needed to do next. First, I realized that Robert believed he had gotten away with attempted murder. He thought I had no idea that my fall wasn't an accident. He thought I believed his story about being worried when I didn't come home from my solo hike. He had no idea that I remembered everything, including the feeling of his hands on my back and the hateful words he had spoken as he pushed me toward my death. Second, I understood that if I confronted him directly about what he had done, he would simply deny it. It would be my word against his, and without witnesses or physical evidence, there would be no way to prove that he had tried to kill me. He would claim I was confused from my head injury, that I was making up stories because I was bitter about the divorce. Third, I realized that Robert's plan hadn't failed completely just because I had survived the fall. He was still going to get half of everything in the divorce, and now he had additional leverage because I was injured and vulnerable. He could use my medical condition to argue that I wasn't capable of managing my own affairs, that I needed his help and support during my recovery. But most importantly, I understood that Robert had revealed his true nature completely. This wasn't just about greed or his midlife crisis affair. This was about a man who was willing to commit murder to get what he wanted, which meant that as long as I was alive, I was in danger. As long as I had something he wanted, he would continue to be a threat to my safety. So I made a decision that would have been unthinkable to the old Dorothy, the woman who had spent 3 decades putting her husband's needs before her own. I decided that Robert needed to pay for what he had done, and I was going to be the one to make sure that happened. The first step was getting out of the hospital and away from Robert's watchful eyes. I told the doctors I was feeling much better and that I wanted to go home to recover in familiar surroundings. Robert insisted on taking me home personally and staying with me to help with my care. He was so attentive, so concerned about my well-being, that the medical staff practically gave him a humanitarian award for being such a devoted husband. What they didn't know was that Robert was planning to finish what he had started on that hillside. What he didn't know was that I was planning to stop him before he got the chance. On the drive home from the hospital, Robert kept asking me about my memory of the accident. Did I remember how I fell? Did I remember anything unusual about that day? Was I sure I had been hiking alone? He was fishing for information, trying to determine whether I remembered his role in my near-death experience. I played the part of the confused, injured wife perfectly. I told him my memory of that day was fuzzy, that I remembered starting my hike, but nothing after that, until I woke up at the bottom of the ravine. I said the doctors told me that memory loss was common with head injuries, and that some of those memories might never come back. I could see the relief on his face when I said that. He thought he was safe. He thought his secret was secure. He had no idea that every detail of his attempt to murder me was burned into my memory with crystal clarity. When we got home, Robert immediately went into caretaker mode. He helped me get settled on the couch, brought me pain medication and water, made sure I was comfortable. He told me he had decided to postpone the finalization of our divorce until I was fully recovered, that he couldn't bear the thought of abandoning me when I needed help. Of course, his real motivation had nothing to do with compassion. He was buying himself time to figure out another way to kill me, a way that wouldn't look suspicious given my recent accident. Maybe another fall down our stairs. Maybe a medication overdose that could be blamed on my confusion from the head injury. Maybe a house fire that started while I was sleeping. But Robert had made one crucial mistake in his planning. He had assumed that the woman he married 32 years ago, the trusting nurse who always saw the best in people, was the same woman who had survived his murder attempt. He had no idea that his betrayal had created someone completely different, someone who was not going to be a victim ever again. While Robert busied himself playing the role of the caring husband, I was making phone calls and arrangements that would ensure justice was served. I called my nephew, Marcus, a police detective in the next county, and asked him to come visit me privately. I told him I had something important to discuss with him, something that couldn't wait. I also called my lawyer and asked her to put the divorce proceedings on hold temporarily, telling her I needed time to recover from my injuries before we moved forward. What I didn't tell her was that by the time I was ready to proceed with the divorce, the circumstances were going to be very different than anyone expected. Most importantly, I called my old supervisor from the hospital, a woman named Janet, who had become a close friend over the years. I asked her if she could recommend a private investigator, someone discreet who specialized in gathering evidence of infidelity and financial fraud. I told her it was for a friend who was going through a difficult divorce. Janet gave me the name of a man named Thomas Chen, a former police detective who now worked as a private investigator specializing in matrimonial cases. When I called him and explained my situation, leaving out the part about the attempted murder for now, he was immediately interested in helping me. Thomas told me that cases like mine were more common than people realized, that cheating spouses often try to hide assets or manipulate financial situations during divorce proceedings. He said he had extensive experience gathering evidence of adultery, financial misconduct, and other behavior that could affect divorce settlements. What Thomas didn't know yet was that this case was going to be about much more than adultery and hidden assets. This was going to be about attempted murder and a conspiracy to defraud me of everything I had worked for my entire life. Over the next week, while Robert continued his performance as the devoted husband, I was quietly building a case against him that would destroy his plans and ensure that justice was served. I was gathering evidence, making recordings, and documenting everything that would be needed to prove what he had done and what he was still planning to do. The old Dorothy would have confronted Robert directly, would have demanded an explanation and hoped for an apology. The old Dorothy would have trusted the legal system to protect her and ensure fairness. The old Dorothy would have believed that people were fundamentally good and that her husband of 32 years couldn't possibly be capable of murder. But the old Dorothy was dead, buried at the bottom of that ravine, along with my broken bones and spilled blood. The woman who emerged from that hospital was someone completely different, someone who understood that sometimes the only way to get justice is to take matters into your own hands. Into your own hands. The woman who came home from that hospital was someone who had learned the hardest lesson life can teach, that the person sleeping next to you for 32 years can look you in the eye and try to end your life for money. That love means nothing when greed takes over, that sometimes the only person you can truly count on is yourself. Robert had no idea what he was dealing with now. He saw the same gray-haired woman he had pushed off that cliff, the same trusting wife who had supported him for 3 decades. But inside, everything had changed. The naive woman who made excuses for his failures was gone forever. In her place was someone who understood that survival meant being smarter, more cunning, and more determined than the person trying to destroy you. During that first week home, I watched Robert like a scientist studying a dangerous specimen. Every gesture, every word, every expression told me something about his true intentions. When he thought I was sleeping, I saw him going through my purse, looking at my medications, checking the dosages. When he thought I was in the bathroom, I caught him researching my insurance policies on his laptop. When he thought I couldn't hear, I listened to his whispered phone conversations with Cheryl about their future plans. The picture became crystal clear very quickly. Robert and Cheryl had worked out every detail of their scheme. They had calculated exactly how much money they would have together once Robert inherited everything from my death. They had already looked at houses they wanted to buy, trips they wanted to take, the life they would build with my money. Cheryl was even more involved in the planning than I had initially realized. She wasn't just the other woman. She was a full partner in conspiracy to commit murder. What they didn't know was that every conversation was being recorded. Thomas Chen had equipped me with devices so small and sophisticated that Robert never suspected their existence. Every incriminating word, every cruel laugh, every detail of their plans was being captured and documented for future use. The most chilling moment came on my 4th night home. I was pretending to sleep on the couch when Robert came downstairs around midnight. I heard him in the kitchen, and through half-closed eyes, I watched him preparing what looked like my usual evening tea. But this time, I saw him add something to the cup, something from a small bottle he pulled from his pocket. My heart started racing, but I forced myself to remain perfectly still. When he brought the tea over to wake me up, claiming he thought I might be thirsty, I knew this was the moment. This was his second attempt to kill me, and he thought it would look like an accidental overdose of pain medication, combined with my legitimate prescriptions. I took the cup with trembling hands, thanking him for being so thoughtful. Then I pretended to drink while actually just letting the liquid touch my lips. When Robert went back upstairs, I poured the entire contents into a container that Thomas had given me for exactly this purpose. By morning, we would know exactly what poison my loving husband had tried to give me. The laboratory results came back 2 days later. Robert had mixed a lethal combination of my prescribed pain medication with additional drugs that would have stopped my heart within hours. The amount was carefully calculated to look like an accidental overdose by a confused elderly woman who had forgotten how much medication she had already taken. It was sophisticated, premeditated, and absolutely intended to kill me. But instead of dying as Robert had planned, I was gathering evidence that would destroy him completely. Every phone call, every conversation with Cheryl, every attempt to access my financial information, every detail of their murder plot was being documented by professionals who knew exactly how to build an airtight case. Thomas Chen was more than just a private investigator. He was a former police detective with connections throughout law enforcement. When I told him about the attempted poisoning and showed him the laboratory results, his entire demeanor changed. This was no longer just a case of adultery and financial fraud. This was attempted murder, and Thomas knew exactly what needed to happen next. The plan we developed was simple but effective. We would let Robert and Cheryl continue with their scheme while we gathered more evidence. We would document every aspect of their conspiracy. And when we had everything we needed to ensure convictions, we would spring our trap in a way that would leave them both facing the consequences of their actions. But first, I had to survive whatever Robert was planning next. The poison tea had failed, which meant he would have to try something else. And based on his phone conversations with Cheryl, I knew he was getting desperate. The longer I stayed alive, the more chance there was that someone might discover what he had done on that hillside. The breakthrough came exactly 2 weeks after I returned home from the hospital. Robert announced that he thought it would be good for my recovery if we took a short trip together, maybe went back to some of the places we had enjoyed during happier times in our marriage. He suggested we drive up to the mountains, stay in a cabin for a few days, give me a change of scenery while I healed. Of course, what he really wanted was to get me somewhere isolated, where he could finish what he had started. Somewhere far from neighbors and witnesses, where another accident could happen and my body might not be found for days or weeks. I agreed to the trip enthusiastically, telling Robert how thoughtful he was being and how much I was looking forward to spending quiet time together. What I didn't tell him was that Thomas Chen and his team would be following us every mile of the way, and that law enforcement officials in 3 counties had been briefed on the situation. The cabin Robert had rented was perfect for his purposes. It was miles from the nearest neighbor, surrounded by dense forest, and accessible only by a narrow dirt road that would be easy to make look like the scene of a tragic car accident. Robert had thought of everything, or so he believed. What Robert didn't know was that the cabin was already under surveillance before we even arrived. What he didn't know was that every room was equipped with recording devices. What he didn't know was that a team of law enforcement officers was positioned within minutes of our location, ready to move the moment his next murder attempt began. On our second night at the cabin, Robert made his move. I was sitting on the front porch enjoying the mountain air when he came outside, carrying 2 glasses of wine. He handed me one with that same loving smile I had trusted for 32 years, the smile that now made my skin crawl because I knew what it really meant. We sat together, watching the sunset, Robert playing the part of the devoted husband, trying to help his wife recover from a terrible accident. He talked about our early years together, reminiscing about trips we had taken and dreams we had shared. If I hadn't known he was planning to kill me within the hour, it might have been a beautiful moment. As the sun disappeared behind the mountains and darkness settled over the forest, Robert suggested we take a walk down to the lake. He said the moonlight on the water would be romantic, that it would be good for me to get some gentle exercise. He was so convincing, so caring in his suggestion, that anyone watching would have thought he genuinely had my best interests at heart. I agreed to the walk, just as I had agreed to the mountain hike 3 weeks earlier. But this time, I knew exactly what Robert was planning. This time, I was ready for him. This time, he was walking into a trap instead of leading me into one. We made our way down the narrow path toward the lake, Robert supporting my arm and asking repeatedly if I was feeling steady enough to continue. The path was rocky and uneven, with a steep drop-off on one side that led down to the water. It was the perfect place for another tragic accident, another fall that would kill an elderly woman who was still recovering from her previous injuries. About halfway down the path, Robert stopped walking. He turned to me with that same expression of hatred I had seen right before he pushed me off the cliff. The mask was coming off again. The pretense of love and concern was disappearing as his true nature emerged. But this time, instead of surprise and shock, I felt only cold determination. This time, I was ready for what was coming. This time, Robert was about to discover that his victim was no longer the helpless woman he thought he was dealing with. As Robert reached out to push me toward the edge of the path, powerful flashlights suddenly illuminated the entire area. Voices shouted commands from multiple directions. Armed officers emerged from the darkness, surrounding us completely. In seconds, Robert found himself face down on the ground, with his hands cuffed behind his back, while I stood, safely protected by the law enforcement team that had been watching every move he made. The look of absolute shock and terror on Robert's face was something I will treasure for the rest of my life. The man who had tried to murder me twice, who had plotted with his girlfriend to steal everything I had worked for, who had shown me nothing but cruelty and greed, was finally facing the consequences of his actions. But that was just the beginning of Robert's problems. As the officers were reading him his rights, Thomas Chen was already coordinating with law enforcement in our home county to arrest Cheryl as a co-conspirator in the murder plot. The evidence we had gathered over the past 2 weeks was more than sufficient to charge both of them with attempted murder, conspiracy, fraud, and a dozen other felonies that would ensure they spent the rest of their lives in prison. As Robert was loaded into the police car, still protesting his innocence and claiming this was all a misunderstanding, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: peace. For the first time since I had discovered his affair, I felt completely The man who had betrayed me, tried to kill me, and planned to steal everything I had worked for was finally going to pay the price for his evil actions. But my story was far from over. In fact, the most satisfying part was still to come. Because while Robert and Cheryl had been plotting my death, I had been planning something else entirely. Something that would ensure they both understood exactly what it felt like to lose everything that mattered to them, just as they had tried to do to me. The next morning, I drove home to begin the most important phase of my plan, the phase where Robert and Cheryl would discover that targeting the wrong woman had consequences they never could have imagined, the phase where they would learn that sometimes the victim has more power than the predator ever realized, the phase where justice would be served in ways that would make them wish they had never heard my name. When I walked through my front door that evening, I felt like I was entering a completely different house than the one I had left just 3 days earlier. Everything looked the same, but I was seeing it all through new eyes. The living room, where Robert had played the caring husband. The kitchen, where he had prepared poisoned tea. The bedroom, where we had shared 3 decades of what I thought was love, but now understood had been nothing but lies and manipulation. But most importantly, I was seeing opportunities that Robert and Cheryl had never considered, because they had underestimated exactly who they were dealing with. They thought they were targeting a helpless elderly woman who would be easy to manipulate and dispose of. They had no idea they had chosen someone who possessed resources, connections, and determination they couldn't even begin to comprehend. You see, during my 40 years as a nurse, I hadn't just been saving lives and earning money. I had been building relationships, deep, meaningful connections with people from every walk of life. Doctors who trusted my judgment completely. Lawyers who had worked with me on medical malpractice cases. Business owners whose family members I had cared for during their most vulnerable moments. Police officers whose children I had treated in the emergency room. Judges whose spouses had been under my care. In 4 decades of nursing, you don't just collect paychecks. You collect favors. You build a network of people who remember kindness during their darkest hours. People who understand that sometimes the system fails good people, and who are willing to step outside normal procedures to make sure justice is served. Robert and Cheryl thought they were dealing with an isolated old woman with no one to turn to and no way to fight back. They couldn't have been more wrong. My first call was to Dr. Patricia Williams, the chief of staff at the hospital where I had worked for so many years. Patricia and I had been through countless emergencies together, had saved lives side by side, had developed the kind of professional relationship built on absolute trust and mutual respect. When I told her what had happened, when I explained that my husband had tried to murder me for insurance money and inheritance, her response was immediate and fierce. Patricia didn't just offer sympathy, she offered action. Within hours, she had contacted every medical professional in our network, sharing the details of Robert's poisoning attempt and his conspiracy with Cheryl. By the end of that first day, word had spread through the entire medical community about what Robert had done and what kind of man he really was. This might not sound significant, but in a small city like ours, the medical community is incredibly influential. These are the people who treat your family members, who know your most private health information, who have the power to make your life comfortable or miserable when you need medical care. And now every single one of them knew that Robert was a man who had tried to murder his wife for money. My second call was to James Morrison, a lawyer who specialized in financial fraud and elder abuse. James had represented several families whose cases I had worked on over the years, and he owed me more favors than I could count. When I explained the situation with Robert and Cheryl, James immediately understood the bigger picture that they had missed completely. You see, when Robert tried to kill me, he hadn't just committed attempted murder. He had violated dozens of financial regulations and laws that most people don't even know exist. The moment he put his name on my accounts with the intention of inheriting everything through my death, he had committed financial fraud. When he conspired with Cheryl to use her money to fund his legal fees during our divorce, they had both participated in a scheme to manipulate court proceedings. When they began making plans for how to spend my inheritance before I was actually dead, they had created a paper trail of premeditated financial crimes. James assured me that by the time he was finished with Robert and Cheryl, they would both be facing financial ruin even before their criminal trials began. He would freeze every asset they had access to, challenge every financial transaction they had made in the past year, and ensure that they both spent every penny they had on legal fees just to stay out of prison. But the most important call I made was to my nephew, Marcus, the police detective I had contacted while I was still recovering from Robert's first murder attempt. Marcus had been working behind the scenes throughout the entire investigation, coordinating with Thomas Chen and the various law enforcement agencies involved in building the case against Robert and Cheryl. Now that they were both in custody, Marcus explained to me exactly how extensive their crimes had been and what kind of evidence the police had gathered. It was far worse than even I had realized. The investigation had uncovered that Robert and Cheryl had been planning my murder for over 6 months. They had researched different methods, discussed various scenarios, and even practiced their stories about how they would react to news of my death. The police had recordings of conversations where they laughed about how easy it would be to fool everyone into believing I had died accidentally. But the most disturbing discovery was that I wasn't their first victim. Cheryl's previous husband, the one who had supposedly died of natural causes and left her the inheritance she was using to fund their schemes, had actually died under suspicious circumstances that were now being reinvestigated. The police suspected that Robert and Cheryl had been partners in crime for much longer than anyone had realized. This information changed everything. This wasn't just about my attempted murder anymore. This was about 2 people who had made a career out of targeting vulnerable individuals, stealing their assets, and eliminating them when it became convenient. They were predators who had been operating for years, and I had simply been their latest intended victim. Marcus assured me that with the evidence they had gathered, both Robert and Cheryl would be facing life sentences without the possibility of parole. But he also warned me that their trials could take months or even years to complete, and that in the meantime, I needed to be prepared for them to try every possible tactic to escape responsibility for their actions. That's when I realized that waiting for the legal system to deliver justice wasn't enough. Robert and Cheryl had destroyed my sense of safety, my trust in the people closest to me, and my belief that good people are protected from evil. They had turned my golden years into a nightmare of fear and betrayal. The legal system would eventually punish them, but it wouldn't undo the damage they had caused or restore what they had taken from me. But I could do something the legal system couldn't do. I could make sure they understood exactly what it felt like to lose everything that mattered to them, just as they had tried to do to me. I could ensure that even if they somehow managed to avoid the worst legal consequences of their actions, they would still pay a price that would follow them for the rest of their lives. The plan I developed over the next few weeks was more comprehensive and devastating than anything Robert and Cheryl could have imagined. It involved every connection I had built over 4 decades of professional life, every favor I had earned through years of helping others, every resource I had access to through my network of friends and colleagues. The first phase targeted their reputations and social standing. Within days of their arrest, everyone in our community knew exactly what Robert and Cheryl had done. Not just the basic facts that appeared in the newspaper, but the detailed, humiliating truth about how they had planned and attempted to execute their scheme. I made sure that every member of Robert's family understood that he had tried to murder his wife for money. I contacted his employer and provided them with documentation of his criminal activities. I reached out to every friend, neighbor, and acquaintance we had shared during our 32 years of marriage and explained exactly why Robert was sitting in a jail cell awaiting trial for attempted murder. The response was swift and brutal. Robert's employer terminated his position immediately, citing moral turpitude clauses in his contract. His family members publicly distanced themselves from him, with his own brother releasing a statement condemning his actions and expressing sympathy for me. Friends we had known for decades refused to post bail or provide character references for his defense, but the treatment Cheryl received was even more devastating. I discovered that she had built her entire social identity around being a wealthy widow who was generous with local charities and community organizations. She served on several nonprofit boards, hosted fundraising events at her home, and was considered a pillar of the community by people who had no idea about her true nature. I made sure every single one of those organizations knew exactly what kind of person they had been associating with. I provided them with copies of the recorded conversations where Cheryl laughed about my impending murder and discussed how she would spend my inheritance money. I shared the police reports detailing her role in financing and planning my attempted assassination. The reaction was immediate and complete. Every nonprofit board she served on demanded her resignation. Every charity she had supported returned her donations and banned her from future events. The country club, where she had been a member for over a decade, revoked her membership. The social circles she had worked years to join turned their backs on her completely. Within 2 weeks of their arrest, both Robert and Cheryl had been transformed from respected community members into social pariahs. Everywhere they went, people knew exactly who they were and what they had done. There was no hiding from their crimes, no pretending they were anything other than failed murderers who had been caught before they could complete their evil plan. But destroying their reputations was just the beginning. The second phase of my plan targeted their financial resources and future prospects in ways they never saw coming. James Morrison, my lawyer friend, had been busy filing civil lawsuits against both Robert and Cheryl on multiple fronts. He sued Robert for attempted murder, financial fraud, emotional distress, and breach of fiduciary duty. He sued Cheryl for conspiracy, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and interference with my marriage. But most importantly, he filed suits designed to freeze and seize every asset they had access to. The legal strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. Even if Robert and Cheryl somehow managed to beat the criminal charges against them, which was virtually impossible given the evidence, they would still be liable for damages in civil court, where the burden of proof was much lower. And unlike criminal cases, civil judgments could be collected immediately through asset seizures and wage garnishments. Within a month, Cheryl's inheritance from her deceased husband was completely frozen, pending the outcome of multiple lawsuits. Her house was placed under a legal hold that prevented her from selling or refinancing it. Her investment accounts were locked down by court order. Even her expensive jewelry and artwork were seized as potential assets that could be used to pay damages. Robert's situation was even worse because he had fewer assets to begin with. The money he had expected to receive from our divorce was now completely off the table. Obviously, since you can't inherit from someone you tried to murder. His retirement accounts were frozen to secure potential damage awards. Even his car was repossessed because he could no longer make the payments without access to his financial resources. But the most devastating blow came when James discovered that Cheryl's previous husband's death was indeed being reinvestigated as a possible murder. If the police could prove that she had killed her first husband for his inheritance, then that inheritance would be subject to forfeiture under laws that prevent criminals from profiting from their crimes. This meant that even if Cheryl somehow avoided conviction in my case, she could still lose everything she had stolen from her previous victim. She was facing the possibility of complete financial ruin, regardless of how her legal troubles were resolved. The third phase of my plan was perhaps the most satisfying, because it ensured that even if Robert and Cheryl eventually got out of prison, they would never be able to rebuild the lives they had destroyed through their own greed and evil. Through my network of medical professionals, I made sure that both Robert and Cheryl were flagged in every medical database and insurance system in the region, not for anything illegal or unethical, but simply to ensure that every healthcare provider who treated them knew exactly who they were dealing with. When you've tried to murder someone with poisoned medication, medical professionals tend to be extremely cautious about your treatment and very thorough in documenting every interaction. This meant that for the rest of their lives, Robert and Cheryl would face extra scrutiny, additional questions, and heightened suspicion every time they needed medical care. They would never again be able to simply walk into a doctor's office or hospital and be treated as normal patients. Their crimes would follow them into every aspect of their health care for as long as they lived. I also worked with law enforcement contacts to ensure that both Robert and Cheryl were placed on every relevant watch list and monitoring system available, not just for their current crimes, but as potential threats to elderly and vulnerable individuals in general. This meant that any future suspicious behavior, any contact with other potential victims, any attempt to repeat their criminal patterns would be immediately flagged and investigated. The message was clear. They would never again have the opportunity to target innocent people the way they had targeted me. Their criminal history would be permanently attached to their names, following them wherever they went, and preventing them from ever again appearing to be trustworthy, respectable members of society. But perhaps the most important element of my plan was ensuring that their story became a cautionary tale that would protect other potential victims from similar schemes. I worked with local media outlets, senior advocacy groups, and law enforcement agencies to publicize the details of Robert and Cheryl's crimes and the warning signs that other elderly individuals should watch for. Their case became a textbook example of elder financial abuse and domestic violence that was featured in training materials for police officers, social workers, and healthcare providers. Their names and photographs were included in educational materials distributed to senior centers and retirement communities throughout the region. This meant that Robert and Cheryl's crimes would continue serving a purpose long after they were imprisoned. Their evil actions would help protect other innocent people from similar predators, ensuring that their legacy would be one of prevention and awareness rather than successful victimization. By the time their criminal trials began 6 months later, Robert and Cheryl had already lost everything that mattered to them. Their reputations were destroyed beyond repair. Their financial resources were completely exhausted by legal fees and civil judgments. Their social connections had abandoned them entirely. Their future prospects were non-existent. They sat in that courtroom as broken, defeated individuals who had learned the hardest possible lesson about the consequences of trying to destroy an innocent person. They had targeted someone they thought was weak and vulnerable, and instead, they had encountered someone with the strength, intelligence, and resources to fight back in ways they never could have imagined. The trial itself was almost anticlimactic because the evidence against them was so overwhelming. The recordings of their conversations planning my murder, The laboratory analysis of the poison Robert had tried to give me, the documentation of their financial schemes and conspiracy, the testimony of law enforcement officers who had witnessed Robert's second attempt to kill me at the mountain cabin. Their lawyers tried every possible defense strategy, but there was simply no way to explain away the mountain of evidence that had been gathered against them. They tried to claim I had manipulated the evidence. They tried to argue that their conversations had been taken out of context. They even tried to suggest that I had somehow orchestrated the entire situation to frame them. But none of their desperate attempts at avoiding responsibility were successful. The jury took less than 2 hours to find both Robert and Cheryl guilty on all charges. The judge sentenced Robert to life in prison without the possibility of parole for attempted murder and conspiracy. Cheryl received the same sentence as his co-conspirator. As they were led away in handcuffs to begin their life sentences, I felt a sense of closure that I hadn't experienced since that terrible day when Robert first pushed me off that cliff. Justice had been served not just through the legal system, but through the comprehensive consequences they faced for their evil actions. But even more importantly, I had learned something about myself that I never would have discovered if Robert hadn't betrayed me so completely. I had learned that I was stronger, more resourceful, and more capable of protecting myself than I had ever realized. The woman who had spent 32 years making excuses for her husband's failures had been replaced by someone who understood that true strength comes from refusing to be a victim. The money that Robert and Cheryl had tried to steal from me was still mine. The life they had tried to end was still being lived on my own terms. The future they had tried to destroy had become brighter and more promising than ever before. I had not just survived their attack. I had emerged from it as a completely transformed person who would never again allow anyone to take advantage of my kindness or trust. Today, as I sit in my beautiful new home, overlooking the lake, surrounded by genuine friends who value me for who I am rather than what I can provide them, I often reflect on how dramatically my life changed after that terrible experience. The woman who was pushed off that cliff by her own husband was someone I barely recognize now. That woman had spent decades believing that love meant sacrifice, that being a good wife meant accepting whatever treatment came her way, that family loyalty required endless forgiveness even when faced with unforgivable acts. The transformation didn't happen overnight. Even after Robert and Cheryl were convicted and sentenced to life in prison, I struggled with feelings I had never experienced before. Anger that felt foreign after a lifetime of trying to see the good in everyone. Bitterness that seemed to contradict everything I had believed about forgiveness and moving forward. A hardness around my heart that protected me from future pain, but also made it difficult to trust anyone new who entered my life. For months after the trial, I found myself jumping at unexpected sounds, checking and rechecking the locks on my doors, suspicious of every phone call and every knock at the door. The psychological damage from Robert's betrayal ran deeper than the physical injuries from his attempt on my life. He hadn't just tried to kill my body. He had tried to kill my spirit, my ability to believe in the goodness of people, my capacity to form meaningful relationships based on trust and mutual respect. But slowly, with the help of a therapist who specialized in trauma recovery and the support of the genuine friendships I had formed during my ordeal, I began to heal in ways that surprised me. I discovered that surviving Robert's attacks had revealed strengths I never knew I possessed. The same determination that had helped me crawl out of that ravine after his first murder attempt became the foundation for building a completely new life on my own terms. The financial settlement from the civil lawsuits against Robert and Cheryl provided me with resources I had never imagined having. Beyond recovering the money they had tried to steal from me, the courts awarded substantial damages for pain and suffering, emotional distress, and punitive damages designed to send a message about the consequences of elder abuse and domestic violence. The total amount was more than I could have earned in several lifetimes of nursing. Sometimes life forces you to discover who you really are beneath all the roles you've played for others. Robert and Cheryl thought they were destroying a helpless old woman, but they actually created someone who refused to be anyone's victim ever again. If you're facing betrayal or abuse from people you trusted, remember that you have more strength than you realize. Your story doesn't end when someone tries to write your ending for you.